I came to be involved in the CPRE, as some of you have already heard me say, because I grew up in the countryside and I never stopped caring about it even when I went to live in a town. My parents were country people who did country things. They were absolutely not readers, incidentally. My mum read a bit, and I know I've said this to some of you before. My father, towards the end of his much longer than my mum's life, looked at me with a funny expression on his face one day and said that he reckoned he'd read half a book in his life. And those of you who've heard me say that before will remember that I also remember that half book was The Lonely Skier by Hammond Innes, which somebody must have told him was a thriller. But not for him, evidently not for him. And I have lots of memories of him taking it on summer holidays at about this time of year and impatiently turning over the pages while it was pouring with rain outside, and then gratefully throwing the book aside when the sun came out and rushing off to do the things that he preferred to do. So really from the start with me, the countryside was kind of imprinted on me. And I would not have ended up living the life that I have led, that I intend to continue leading as long as I have breath in my body, which is in an important way devoted to poems and to thinking about poetry and talking about poetry and teaching it and so on. Had it not been for a genius English teacher who walked straight into my head at the school that you and I both went to, very unexpectedly walked straight into my head, turned all the lights on, and made me think that being committed to poetry was going to be a very important part of my life. But he did this in a very subtle way, I can see with hindsight, which is not to say, okay, so like most teenagers, you're a bit kind of bolshily fed up with the life that you've been leading, and over here in the sunlit uplands, there's a completely different life that you can kind of move across to. He said, well, here are the sunlit uplands over here, and it will be different. But actually, there's lots in your upbringing, in the things that you already care about, that you can carry over with you, and speak about within poems, and make seem precious and interesting and important in poems. So it was a big shift. It had a kind of samizdat feel about it, which I thought was very exciting, and still do. But it was not an absolute sort of annulment of everything that had led up to it. And one of those first people that I read then was Wordsworth. I started writing poems pretty much the same time as I started reading them, and I'm going to read you 4 bits of poems, none of them very long. This is a bit from Tintern Abbey, which you all know, but it can never be heard too many times, that I think, for me, absolutely distills so much of what we care about as an organisation. This is the poem, as you remember, that he writes going back to a landscape on the Wye 5 years after he's first seen it. So the poem is filled with a sense of revisiting rather than encountering for the first time, seeing it with a kind of more adult, more penetrating wisdom than he felt able to do the first time that he encountered it. These beauteous forms, he says, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them, in hours of weariness, sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart. And passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration, feelings too of unremembered pleasure, such perhaps as have no slight or trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life, his little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Nor less, I trust, to them I may have owed another gift of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened, that serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on until the breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. I've always thought it very interesting in that beautiful, extraordinary passage written when he was 28, is the movement it makes from a very concrete, highly visual kind of language. I'm not going to turn this into an English lecture, don't worry. But it is worth noticing, I think, that it does move very interestingly from a very concrete kind of language, particular things, to a much more abstracted kind of language we see into the life of things. And actually that, all of us, I think, would feel is a very familiar thing as we grapple with that sort of pulsing sense of connection, the numinous that we feel standing in a beautiful field or looking at a beautiful sunset or whatever it might be. We think that we reach for very large concepts in order to feel somehow adequate to the feelings that we're having. And that's what happens in that poem, and fair enough, he does it very beautifully. But actually, of course, it's the particulars of things that we value so highly. It's looking very hard at particular objects, particular stones, particular leaves, particular trees, particular blades of grass, particular everything that allow us, because this is how the way our species works, that allow us to see into the life of things, into that life of things. So by concentrating on particular things, the large things become available. In fact, it's really the only way that they become available. We see that in the great legacy that Wordsworth leaves. We see it in Tennyson's poems, we see it in Christina Rossetti, and we see it very interestingly in Hopkins at the end of the 19th century, not published, of course, until the early years of the 20th century, but importantly a late 19th century poet. And I think this poem, Inversnaid, 4 verses long only, is really a kind of poster poem for CPRE. This darksome burn, horseback brown, his roll-rock high road roaring down, in coop and in comb the fleece of his foam flutes, and lo, to the lake falls home. A wind-puff bonnet of fawn broth turns and twindles over the broth of a pool so pitch-black, fell frowning, it rounds and rounds despair to drowning. Degged with dew, dappled with dew, are the groins of the braes that the brook threads through. Wiry heathpacks, flitches of fern, and the bead bonny ash that sits over the burn. What would the world be, once bereft of wet and of wilderness? Let them be left. Oh, let them be left, wildness and wet. Long live the weeds and the wilderness yet. It's wonderful, isn't it? And a very good illustration, perhaps, I mean, he illustrates better than almost anybody, this sense of the life, the big life being available to us through particulars. And so on through the 20th century, into the 20th century. Many of you know about my obsession with Edward Thomas, any one of whose poems I could read to prove the sort of connection and articulation I'm talking about here. His poem, The Manor Farm, for instance, where he goes to the lengths of courting sentimentality, I must say, even to establish a sense of deep history beneath the present, a time in which he says, this England, old already, was called merry, or Thomas Hardy, or the early English W.H. Auden, or Ted Hughes, more or less passive, or Philip Larkin in his offsetting of urban stresses and strains with country pleasures. The trees are coming into leaf. Remember that beautiful poem called The Trees? The trees are coming into leaf, like something almost being said that ends, last year is dead, they seem to say, begin afresh, afresh, afresh. And in his campaigning poem, Going, Going, which really should be another of our poster poems, I think. I'm saying all this because, among other reasons, I think it's important to feel that the language in which which is really what I was meant to be implying when I was talking about Wordsworth, the language in which we enjoy the countryside, in which we try and describe the feelings that it gives us, are in some important and central way the terms that the poets have given to us, whether we know that or not. I mean, some of us are poetry readers and some of us are not. I fully realise that. But whether we know it or not, whether we're poetry readers or not, these are the languages which have entered the national bloodstream, which have entered all our bloodstreams, and do form a part of our consciousness. So this is Larkin's poem, Going, Going. It's a little bit over the top, I thought when I first read it. Now I think it might be right on the money. I thought it would last my time, the sense that beyond the town there would always be fields and farms where the village louts could climb, such trees as were not cut down. I knew there'd be false alarms in the papers about old streets and split-level shopping, but some have always been left so far. And when the old part retreats, as the bleak high-risers come, we can always escape in the car. Things are tougher than we are, just as earth will always respond, however we mess it about. Chuck filth in the sea if you must, the tides will be clean beyond. But what do I feel now? Doubt or age, simply? The crowd is young in the M1 cafe. Their kids are screaming for more houses, more parking allowed, more caravan sites, more pay. On the business page, a score of spectacled grins approve some takeover bid that entails 5% more profit and 10% more in the estuaries. Move your works to the unspoilt dales, grey area grants. And when you try to get near the sea in summer, it seems just now to be happening so very fast. Despite all the land left free, for the first time, I feel somehow this isn't going to last. That before I snuff it, the whole boiling will be bricked in, except for the tourist parts. First slum of Europe, a role it won't be so hard to win with a cast of crooks and tarts. That's politics. And that will be England gone. The shadows, the meadows, the lanes, the guild halls, the carved choirs. There'll be books, it will linger on in galleries, but all that remains for us will be concrete and tires. Most things are never meant. This won't be, most likely. But greeds and garbage are too thick strewn to be swept up now, or invent excuses that make them all needs. I just think it will happen soon. Well, thanks to us, we hope that it won't happen so soon. The same sort of things that I'm talking about, the same articulations of these deep feelings go, of course, on into the 21st century when these male poetic voices, which I've been citing, are joined by other men, sure, wonderful Scottish poet who writes about English landscape as well as Scottish landscapes, called John Burnside, I particularly recommend to you. And also, of course, by very distinguished women writers as well, Jo Shapcott, Kathleen Jamie, and Alice Oswald being the best of them for my money. They all do their own thing in original ways, but if for the sake of this speech I had to identify a common idea that linked them all, I'd say that they all share a sense of the difficulty of approaching such an enormous subject as climate change and countryside concern as a part of that difficulty of writing campaigning poems that I was talking about earlier. And it's led them, exactly as I've been saying, to relish details, which in their very careful and rapturous reporting allow us to see their significance in the scheme of things and the interdependence of things in themselves. So I'm just going to read you a poem that you may not know by this wonderful poet, Alice Oswald, which unseasonally is about a snowdrop. But you all know what a snowdrop looks like, so you can call it to mind. A pale and pining girl, head bowed, heart gnawed, whose figure nods and shivers in a shawl of fine white wool, has suddenly appeared in the damp woods, as mild and mute as snowfall. She may not last. She has no strength at all, but stoops and shakes as if she'd stood all night on one bare foot, confiding with the moonlight. One among several hundred clear-eyed ghosts who get up in the cold and blink and turn into these trembling emblems of night frosts, she brings her burnt heart with her in an urn of ashes, which she opens to re-mourn, having no other outlet to express her wildflower sense of wounded gentleness. Yes, she's no more now than a drop of snow on a green stem. Her name is now her calling. Her mind is just a frozen, melting glow of water, swollen to the point of falling, which maybe has no meaning. There's no telling. But what a beauty, what a mighty power of patience, kept intact, is now in flower. Wonderful, wonderful poem. I can't help noticing how many of our local successes do have a literary association. This, I'd suggest, isn't just pure chance, and neither is it exclusively to do with my own main interests. It's because of the point I made earlier in my talk about how writers gave and give us the language to appreciate and explain why the countryside matters, and how the whole population is still alive to this and values it. Think of our success in Laurie Lee's Slad Valley, one of the highlights of the year, really, I think, a classic CPRE campaign to save an iconic green field. Think of our successful campaign against the polytunnels near Dimmock in Gloucestershire, haunt of the Dimmock poets, who included the brother of one of our founders, the poet Lascelles Abercrombie. Think of the way we've joined local battles to save landscapes associated with T.S. Eliot and William Barnes in Dorset, and so on. These victories crystallize in my mind around what became the defining activity of CPRE during my presidency, which is the war to protect the Greenbelt. I don't want to wear rosy specs, but we have seen a change, as Sean was saying in Keats House the other day, in government rhetoric about this. As little as 3 years ago, the talk was all about swapping Greenbelt land and building garden cities. It was all builder bowls and concrete. Now, we still have terrific challenges to face, not just in the Greenbelt, where, as I sit thousands and thousands of houses are destined to be built, but in road building and other outrageous, unnecessary desecrations. And speaking of threats, our defence of these connections has to be made at the same time as we look to the future, to our children and our grandchildren. Everything you do for the here and now is also done for the future. So include the future. Go home and involve your children, your grandchildren, the friends of your grandchildren and children, in your own hopes and fears for the countryside. Remind them, and remind yourselves that we are the country of Shakespeare, of course, which has been implicit in everything I've been saying, and help them to share the language he gave us in his own writing and in what he poured through the writing of everyone who's come after him. Remind them and remind yourselves to aim high, to be idealistic even, but to be practical as well. England may be the country of Shakespeare, but CPRE is the organisation that demanded national parks and green belts and a democratic planning system in the first place. Ask them, and ask yourselves the great fundamental question, how do you want to live? And assure them, as you assure yourselves, that there is an alternative to the spirit-sapping global race, an alternative built on quality of life, on the appreciation of beauty, and on inspiration. Thank you.